Hello, and welcome to Ethics and Moral Problems. My name is Dr. Stephen Bujno, and this is the lecture on Ethic Begins with Being. That may sound odd at first hearing to you. When we ask ourselves, what am I? We usually don't even try to answer that. We just assume that we already know. It's one of these terms that, not unlike justice and beauty and love, we assume that everybody sort of knows the definition, or that it's so generally understood it's not worth investigating. But in ethics, we really have to begin with being, and being is the philosophical understanding of what a thing is. And until we know what a thing is, we are not really able to apply a proper ethical evaluation to it. We will do it within certain medical bounds too, just as far as illustrative purposes. So here's an exercise I want you to play along with me on. If you and I were together in a room, and on the other side of a wall there was a living being, and I'm asking your permission as to whether or not I may go onto the other side of the wall and kill it. You do not know what it is, and for the sake of simplicity in this exercise, let's set aside any questions as to why do you have the authority and why do we have to kill it. Let's just work this out and have it illustrate something to us as far as why we need to know what a thing is before we do anything. So anyway, if I were to ask you, can I go on the other side of the wall and kill this thing? I would hope that the very first thing that you ask of me, what is it that you want to kill? If it's a spider or perhaps a rat, you may not have a big ethical dilemma with that. If I were to tell you that it's a bunny rabbit, at this point you're going to start to question, why would you want to do that? And no, I do not want you to do it. If I were to tell you it's a small child, obviously we'd be aghast that why would you even consider such a thing. But the point is that we only can move ethically with the judgment as to yes or no, and once we know what this thing is. Now, those are all living things: the spider, the rat, the bunny rabbit, and the small child. But do you notice how we place a different notion of value on those things? Now, perhaps somebody to an extreme would value all living things, but we swat flies and we kill viruses and all kinds of stuff. So we have to come to a conclusion as to why do we value some over others. Now, we're going to look at three terms. We're going to look at the term life, the term human, and then the term personhood. And those three terms often get conflated. In other words, they get confused one with the other. And the concept of life, this is a biological term. Now, oftentimes, say in the abortion debate, the argument is over when life begins. We're going to have to quickly learn that that's not really a good starting point. Life is not a beginning thing, it's a continuous thing. We could say that perhaps like with an unborn, it's the beginning of the life for this entity, whatever it is that we're calling it. But an ovum is alive, a sperm is alive, and an oocyte or embryo, whichever you wish to call it, that is alive. And it doesn't die in between. So they have the properties, at the very least, of homeostasis and reproduction, metabolism and such, and there's others. And even most OBGYNs, who probably are, I would imagine the majority, so-called pro-choice, have no issue with saying life begins at fertilization, which means that, why is it that's the thing that we argue about? That's all we're trying to get out here. We're not trying to resolve any issues. So all the things that I spoke about earlier that would be behind the wall, they're all alive, but we really don't value them the same. So we have to start asking ourselves, how do we place a higher value on probably unborn babies, even over bunnies, and certainly over a baby that's been born, over a spider? And then we're going to have to think, what is it that we're evaluating it by, and how are we applying that even to those individuals that are alive and perhaps don't share qualities that we have? So just something to keep in the back of our minds for now concerning the term life. Now, the term human represents anything that, we would call today Homo sapien. And there is a species problem for anybody who studies biology. We're not quite clear as to whether or not the Homo sapien was clearly distinct in the beginning from Neanderthal. So as a species, we may have a little difficulty exactly saying what human is, but we don't have that issue when we go to the zoo. We don't see a giraffe and a human person and get those two confused. So although there might be a species problem, specifically, We don't have a problem when we're talking about ourselves as human and those things that are not human. We do not consider the unborn bunny or the spider to be human. As far as an unborn baby, if it isn't human, you're going to have to ask yourself, then what is it? Like, remember, that's the question. We're always having to answer. Because there's no generic species. There's not a generic species that has the opportunities to become human or giraffe or such. So even with the unborn, it's always a human life. But that doesn't solve the dilemma, and that's the point I'm trying to get. Now, there's a biological understanding of the human person that we do share 99% of our DNA with the chimpanzees. And that's remarkable. Now, it might give somebody the false understanding that we are then, and therefore, 99% like the chimpanzee. But most toddlers can notice the difference between a chimpanzee and a human. So we have to watch that we are not simply reducing ourselves to the biological, to DNA. Because even if there, which I do believe, there's 99% similarities, that 1%, not just 1% distinction in DNA, but tens of thousands of, let's say, processing distinctions. And if you need just a very simple clarification on what that adds up to, the difference between us and a chimpanzee, considering that 1% would include everything from the Sistine Chapel to Led Zeppelin to being able to go bowling, you name it. So there's quite a bit that would make that distinction. But if we're going to say that we have at least a somewhat of a biological understanding of what a human life is, do we value all human life the same? I mean, obviously in our history we have not, but do we even do so now? Just something to keep in the back of our heads. The reality is that some of those with disabilities, we may in pity, depending on the level of disability, but we also probably, if we were to say use artificial, or let's say in vitro fertilization, where perhaps a woman's going to a sperm bank for a donation so that she can give birth without the physical presence of a male, they would not, and I'm not trying to be glib, go into the facility and simply ask for anything. They're going to have certain criteria that they want. They might look at health, intellect, you can go on. Well, are we so intellectually or emotionally schizophrenic that we don't then think that we project those things onto living people with those disabilities? Do we look less at them? It's just something for us to think through. And even, say, somebody in a permanent vegetative state, it's not uncommon for somebody who has had a severe brain injury or is unconscious for someone else to say they're not really there, or that's no longer, Uncle Tony, something like that. Well, then who is it? Okay. So ethics begins with being. We're going to have to just accept to a certain degree that life and human are biological entities, and they can be quantitated. The notion of personhood, unlike the ability of biology to investigate, is not an empirically verifiable term. So, and this is going to be the crucial term for us. We're going to have to say of human life, which of those are or are not personhoods, or are they always personhood? So even if a person who is pro-choice accepts the biological criteria that, let's say, a 13-week-old fetus is a human life, would they grant the notion of personhood to that? Now, if we're going to try to come up with an understanding of what constitutes as personhood, unlike those things that we can use as quantitative aspects to determine life in human, what becomes the observable criteria for personhood? It's going to be a little difficult for us. So you had a little bit of critical thinking and logic. Let's work out a real quick syllogism just to show how important this is for ethics. When anybody goes to the hospital, any of us as patients, we seek care and wellness. And that care and wellness is not simply a service given, but it's a response to us based on our personal dignity. So I think it's safe to assume in this proposition as a judgment that care and wellness is based on personal dignity. Well, if we put that as the second premise in an argument, we could start out with the first premise, saying that personal dignity is based on the value of being. And care and wellness is based on personal dignity. Therefore, care and wellness is tethered to the value of being. So, do we value all human life in the same way? Do we consider those persons? Now, this isn't about whether or not it's medically feasible to help somebody who's in their late 80s that perhaps would need an operation that otherwise would place them in severe danger with a low expected outcome. Maybe we wouldn't hesitate to do that with a 20-year-old. That's not what I'm talking about. But do we look at, the young and the old with the same value? And if not, we know we're not arguing that they are not alive, they're not human. Do you see what we're arguing here is whether or not they're person? So there's no default value for this, which means this is why we have to begin with this. We have to make a determination, just like we're going to see with ethic. We have to come up and say, this is the ethic that I want to apply. We can't just, work off the cuff in the particular moment. So we have to find a way to move from the quantitative to the qualitative. And remember, these terms, life and human, they're factors that can be measured, and at the very least, they're going to be those things that are going to be determined quantitatively by the empirical sciences. So we accept those as objective, because you and I would not want to declare somebody not human, not alive, or not living, or not alive. Alive or not living. But we have a little bit different of an understanding when it comes to the idea of person. All of a sudden now, we're not quite sure how do we apply this. If you apply this where every single living human must be a person, then you're going to have to accept that from fertilization to natural death. If you don't want to do that, then you're going to have to figure out exactly where along that spectrum that personhood begins and what exactly is the criteria for that. So we're going to get to the aspect as to whether or not are the factors that you use to determine personhood, are they discovered? In other words, it's like an essential element like lithium. We give it a different name, but lithium is lithium. We don't, we can't make that properties of lithium become the properties of lead. So is it a nature that we discover, or is it something we construct? And if we construct it, who constructs it, and what criteria do they use? Right now, we're just starting to ask the questions. So this is a qualitative statement, and it's not in the realm of the empirical sciences. It lies in the realm of philosophy and or theology. And the question for us, at least the way we'll leave it right now, is this term objective? Because if it's not objective and it's just subjective, then we're going to have to ask, who is the determining factor? Okay, now, what I want to do here, just to talk a little bit more about the notion of person and then give you some comparative notions. Just understand it in general terms. When we ask questions like, who am I, let's not subsume this into the various roles that we have. Whether that be mother, teacher, patient, student, and such. There has to be something underneath all this. And I want to give you just a real brief understanding of how this notion has evolved over the years. The reality is that back in the times of the Greek plays, when an actor wanted to take on various characters, they would wear a mask. So they would assume that persona. Now, we kind of get this now, because we know when we see an actor or an actress in a movie that they're playing a role, okay? But here, just think in terms of the word person. This is what it originally meant. So it assumed this various persona, represented by the actor holding this mask. By the time it got into, let's say, the 3rd and 4th centuries, the early Christian church, and our concept of personhood is somewhat indebted to this, and there's no way to get around it. When the early Christians were trying to determine the divinity of Christ, for them it was God. Obviously, for the Jews from which they inherited this faith expression, there was only one God, and that was the Father. So how is it that you can have this Jesus as the Son also be God, and the third, Holy Spirit, also be God? And why is that not why is not what's called a trinity? Why is that not three gods? So how can you claim monotheism and still only claim, but yet claim to have these three separate entities, which they didn't know exactly how to explain? Well, they went back to Greek metaphysics, and what they said was this hypostasis. This is like personhood, as opposed to like ousia, which is the Greek term for the substance. So what they said was that the substance of Jesus and the substance of the Holy Spirit and the substance of God the Father, those were all God. So there's only one God. But the hypostasis, the person of the Father, the person of the Son, and the person of the third, we call the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. It was their way of explaining. So this started to develop a little more nuanced understanding of the human person, well, the term person for human life. You have a very famous, though very simple, definition of the human person from the philosopher Boethius, who said that we are a rational animal. So here you can see a species and a genus. So yes, we are animals, but unlike other animals, we are rational. And without arguing if that implies everywhere, this was the beginning of that. And again, with Greek metaphysics, which even the early Christian church used, what they tried to say was that there are things that are essential to the human person. And within, theistic terms, say a soul. And the accidents, here accidents does not mean a mishap. What it means is those non-essential aspects to an individual. So think of, hair color, skin color, height, all those various things. An apple could be green, an apple could be yellow, an apple can be red, and it could be bitter, it could be sweet. All those things change. So they started looking like what is essential to the human person, what is the essence of the human person, and then all the other things, accidents. So the accidents might be what we see and what we can sense, but it's not necessarily perhaps what is essential to the individual. By the time you get through the Enlightenment period, as we'll shortly see here, you start to see the person as an individual, and an individual not unlike it was held before, but now one based in entity as an entity with these various rights and these duties and such, almost like the Aristotelian I. So this is just a real brief view, because we never stop to think that we have inherited an understanding of personhood. It didn't begin with us, and it certainly wasn't always like this. It took time, and we built on it nonetheless. What I want to do here now is I want to give you, let's say, 6 different versions of personhood. They're comparative, and they contradict each other. And I want you to start thinking which one meshes with your view, and then hold on to it. Be consistent. So there's no default view here. If you are theistic, and the ancient Greeks were theistic, they understood this soul being, the essence of the human person. So Aristotle picked up the form, which wasn't, even though it didn't have a separate existence like Plato, but think of the allegory of the cave. When you're outside of the cave, that was the realm of forms. Those were the essences of all things, and they were perfections. Judaism had like a tripart understanding of the human person. Early Christianity and now present Christianity has the body and soul, but they had the body, soul, and spirit. So the nefesh and the basar, and then the spirit was the ruhos, and the nefesh was like this soul. Now, Catholicism uses the word anima. This isn't exclusive, so almost all Christian expressions of the faith would use this, but I'm just being specific because they were entrenched in medieval philosophy. So anima is the idea of our soul. It's what it is. Think of the word animate, think of the word animal. So anything that moves has a soul. Even plants have a soul. We could talk about the distinctions of the soul, but nonetheless, they all have that. But see, all these things gave a form to the human person. So that would be the basis of those. By the time you get up into the Enlightenment, you have John Locke. Now, John Locke is sort of like the father within psychology of personal identity. He understood that, he explained, at least in his view, that the human person was the accumulation of thoughts and actions and the memories and connections. So what connected you in your present age to you when you were 10 were the sharing of the thoughts and the memories and all those connections. And 20 years from now, if we're still roaming the planet, what connects us with our present day would be those things also. And you can see here one of the issues would be if a person loses memory, or if a person's memory isn't going to really be reliable and such. But nonetheless, this was an idea of continuity. And modern psychology plays off of this psychological continuity, which is based in memories and such. Bernard Williams, and I'm jumping around here obviously in the dates. Bernard Williams says that the memory and identity are important, but so are future concerns. So, using an earlier description of the cobbler and the prince, if we see the cobbler's body and we see the prince's body, but what if what really is the prince enters the cobbler's body, and what's really the cobbler enters the prince's body? So here you might think of Freaky Friday, where you have the mother and the daughter, they switch but they retain bodies. If it were the case here with the cobbler and the prince who switched bodies, which one now is the prince? We probably would lean towards, well, I think the prince is inside the cobbler's body, and I think whatever was the cobbler is now in the prince's body. But do you see what that does? It betrays the reliance on the body. We now think that what it is that this person is on the inside. So we almost have this you can't judge a book by its cover attitude, which is true to the extent that if somebody were mocking another person for their height, their weight, their hair color, that's absurd. But it might also be absurd if we only assume that we're inside our bodies, because that would mean that our bodies are nothing more than like the cover of us, almost like the Men in Black, riding these things around and such. There's various things that Bernard Williams did that I won't get into. If you're interested, you could always look it up. But he had scenarios where, well, okay, before you switch, though, what if I were to tell you one of these bodies is going to get $1,000 and the other one's going to be tortured? Would you go into the one that's going to be tortured? Would you go into the one that's going to get $1,000? What if I told you that, and I told you that just before it all happens, you'd forget so you wouldn't know? I mean, he plays all these different scenarios, but you can see that this is basing his views that there's some sort of continuity with the personality that's underneath. Okay. Derek Parfit was a Buddhist, so he didn't really see this idea that there is such a thing as the self. Not that he thought we didn't exist, that's not his point, but that there's really nothing there. So if we really need to say, like, how is our present self like our earlier self, and how will our present self be like our latter self, it's just a matter of degree. It's almost like this stream, and branches that flow through it and such. Now, there's a modern approach, and in this, there's something to this, but I won't have enough time here to build it out. That when we talk about who we talk about ourselves in relation to those around us. So there's something very intrinsic to us, like the center of our person. And that's the core of the human being. And then our individuality, which would include our consciousness. Now, you notice the first few examples I gave you didn't really address that. But we're not just ourselves isolated from all others. We have this relational aspects to us, and we also have a societal ring. So it helps to think in terms of medical care that, it's not just us being affected. The family's involved, and we're involved with them and such. So the ring theory has its applications. Now, a modern intellectual atheist, Daniel Dennett, he offers 6 criteria. These first 3, that we are rational, so you can see that going back to Boethius, but also intentional, like it wasn't a haphazard thing that we have chosen. And we could take a particular stance against a certain thing. He says these 3 things are necessary. In other words, you can't be a human person without these 3 things. And these 3 things, too, are not just exclusively within human animals. They're shared with other species. So he says these are necessary, but they're not sufficient. To add that which would make it sufficient on top of these would be reciprocity. That's the stance is able to be reciprocated. And then we have some form of communication and also consciousness. Now, This idea of consciousness, like it came from the ring theory, here it's applied, as an attribute necessary for the human person, like sufficient, which means what happens when somebody loses consciousness? Now, keep in the back of your mind that consciousness, and by that, I guess we should at least say, minimally, we understand it to mean that we are separate from the world. We understand ourselves distinct from others. This really doesn't happen until about 5 months of age, which means that those people, like Peter Singer, he's an ethicist from Princeton. He is pro-choice. He believes that a woman has a right to have an abortion because the unborn is not a person, but he also doesn't believe it becomes a person at about 5 months of age. So therefore, to terminate the life of a 2 or 3 month old is no different than to terminate the life of a 7th month gestational in utero human life. Now we would take a guess at that, at least the average person would. It's infanticide. But do you notice, at least with Peter Singer, he's intellectually consistent. He's made a decision on this is what the criteria is, and he's going to carry that through to the end of life. So when a person loses consciousness and no longer is aware of themselves, then they no longer are persons, and they too can be euthanized. So again, that may give you a knee-jerk reaction to it, but you're going to have to keep in mind that what is your criteria, and when does your criteria kick in for human person, or does it always? For human life, or is it always there? And then whenever it kicks in, when will also how would that be applied at the end of life? So here's a theistic modern philosopher who just passed away recently that understands the human person as an essential being, but never an isolated being. So we are only ever persons in relation. Let me give an example, hopefully to help make this clear so it doesn't sound too vague. And I'm not trying to comment on what is or is not appropriate outfits for people to wear. But sometimes somebody might say that, and there's a certain truth to this, so I'm not here to argue the case, but they might say that I can wear whatever I like, and if it's revealing, then other people should control their view towards me. It's not my job to dress in a way that doesn't at least allure them in. Okay, so there is something to say that, because we don't, none of us should be objectified for any reason. But it also has a very isolated understanding of the human person. We live in relationship with others. And here's an example that ties into this. If you were to go onto a main street in a town and put three $20 bills on top of your dashboard in your car and leave your car unlocked, the chances of it being stolen are relatively high. If you did go and find a police officer or somebody else, we can only hear them saying, what were you thinking? Now, it is true that that's our personal space, and nobody has the right to violate our personal space. So that's like dressing how we want. We're not arguing that that's not what a person should not be able to do. But it also doesn't give you a very good understanding of yourself within a community. You know where you were parking. You left it open. Do you understand that, our view of who we are can only be in relationship to others? And it does not mean the other person is determining who we are. It just means that we always understand ourselves in relation to that. He also said to be very careful about trying to simply give a neuroscientific understanding of the human person, because it's going to be incomplete. MRIs and such, depending on what emotions we're feeling or what we're going through, certain parts of the brain may show activity, and then it gives us the idea, well, that explains what's happening. But there's just more to that. Again, we're not the sum of our DNA. He would say we're also not simply the sum of what can be measured as far as our brain activity. So he says in the end, I am I and you are you, and this only thing that we can be is with each other. Now, this has implications for ethics, because if you can determine that you're never isolated, and, outside of the ring theory, none of the other aspects really talked about our relationship with other individuals. But this is why we care for others. This is why others care for us. This is why we would say that if you don't care for somebody, or if you walk by an individual who's in agony or suffering, we would say, what kind of human being are you? We'd almost think a reduction in personhood. So personhood is formed this way. Okay, this was a real quick synopsis of just some various theories, and real quickly I covered exactly how the notion of personhood, had its origins and has evolved over time. And on the previous slide, we talked a little bit about this term life and human and how those are objective and can be determined quantitatively. And the notion of personhood doesn't share that. It's not an empirically verifiable notion, so it has to be something that's qualitatively, and that falls into the realm of philosophy and theology. Thank you for listening.